Today I'm going to talk about the Beatles, Jay-Z, Danger Mouse, and remix culture. And this is part of a book that I'm writing about how music is appropriated by artists, how it is changed, and how songs are texts. And the most hybrid text of the lot, I would contend, is uh, is Danger Mouse's remix of the Beatles' White Album and of Jay-Z's The Black Album. Now, just a little bit of background on this. On the 22nd of November 1968, the Beatles released the White Album, and it was one of the most popular albums of the 1960s. It sold 2.5 million copies in a week, and in many ways, it became the album that epitomized the Beatles' work. It was diverse. It had electronic music. It had classical experimental music on it. It had English pastoral folk music on it, and it had great pop music on it. So it was a real mix of an album. Now, importantly for this talk, the White Album is also one of the most famous and most iconic albums of the 1960s, and that is very important, as you will see in a second. The next piece of work was Jay-Z's The Black Album, which was released on the 14th of November 2003. And it, like the Beatles' White Album, attained classic status. It became possibly, again, this is a contentious statement, this is quite contentious, it's arguably the most famous hip-hop album of the 21st century. So, we have the Beatles' White Album, and we have Jay-Z's The Black Album. Now, what happened on the 24th of February 2004, the DJ, Danger Mouse, decided to mix both these albums together, mix a classic rock album from the 1960s with a classic hip-hop album. And he did, and he called it the Grey Album. And of course, he only wanted to release it amongst fellow DJs, friends. He didn't want to disseminate this as a proper release. In a way, it was piracy. And what happened is that Capitol Records, EMI, immediately, it was called Grey Tuesday, they issued a cease and desist order to Danger Mouse and told him that he couldn't release this album because he'd infringed copyright laws. Because what he'd done is he had put together the Beatles songs with Jay-Z's hip-hop songs to create a new work of art. But the big record companies didn't exactly see it like that. Now, what's so interesting about the Grey Album is it's a mashup album by Danger Mouse. As I said, it was released in 2004, and it mixes a cappella versions of rapper Jay-Z's The Black Album and samples from the Beatles album known as the White Album from 1968. The Grey Album very quickly gained notoriety when EMI attempted to halt its distribution. This is very interesting as well. Despite approval for the project from Jay-Z and the two surviving Beatles, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. So they appreciated this work of art. Also, Danger Mouse was quoted as saying that every kick, snare, and chord is taken from the Beatles' White Album and is in their original recording somewhere. Now, Danger Mouse is also known as Brian Burton, and since he mixed the White Album and the Black Album and produced the Grey Album, he's become one of the world's most renowned producers, working for people like Beck and U2. He's attained a huge career from mixing these two classic albums. But very importantly for this lecture, Burton was challenged by a cease and desist letter from EMI. The record company stated that Burton had not obtained copyright permission for use of the Beatles' works, and ordered him and distributors to destroy all copies. Burton countered that his project was an artistic expression of admiration of the Beatles and Jay-Z, and indeed, I think that it is. The supporters of the project agree with me, and they argue that the record company had failed to see the creative, artistic value in this piece of work. And indeed, there is a lot of creative and artistic value in this piece of work. For example, when you listen to Danger Mouse's The Grey Album, you'll have iconic Beatles songs such as While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Revolution Number 9, Blackbird, and they'll be mixed with loops, repetitions, rhymes, raps from Jay-Z's album. And what happens is they become something new. The repetitions, loops, the interrupting of tracks turns into a new work of art. Now, Brian Burton, aka Danger Mouse, is in the tradition of DJs who would do this in clubs. They would mash different songs together, they would interrupt songs, they would start songs in the beginning, the middle, end of a record. If they liked a particular sound, they would just repeat it on a loop. So in a way, Danger Mouse, aka Brian Burton, is asking very profound questions about originality and about authorship, also about copyright law with this album, the Grey Album. And I would also contend that it is a work of art in its own right, because what Danger Mouse does is he goes far back to the 22nd of November 1968. He goes far back to look far forward. And then he has created a forward-thinking, progressive work of art out of old music. And in a way, this isn't quite as revolutionary as it sounds. Bands have been doing this for, DJs, have been doing this for an awful long time. This term mashup, as I said, Danger Mouse is mashing Jay-Z's The Black Album with the White Album to come out with the Grey Album. I mean, I love that. I love that little joke anyway. But mashup means to smash or destroy something. But in the case of Danger Mouse's The Grey Album, he has added quite a lot to those two classic albums. A fresh perspective. He has put in gaps, ellipsis, repetitions, loops. We see the two classic albums completely in a different light. Now, this term mashup can mean to smash or destroy, but it also means to build up and to create something new. And that's exactly what Danger Mouse has done with his mashup of these two iconic albums. Also, this term mashup, which all of you are familiar with, does actually come from Jamaican dub reggae, and it comes from mashing potatoes up and mixing potatoes up, mashing potatoes with other ingredients such as lentils and meat. And then you take something traditional and you morph it, you transform it into something new. The term comes from the Jamaican patois in the early 70s, and the term is evident in songs such as Steel Pulses, Mash It Grizzly, and Mash Down by The Roots. So there's been this tradition for 30, 40, 50 years of taking classic pieces of work, classic songs, and mixing them with other songs. And what makes Danger Mouse, aka Brian Burton, so important that is he's picked, as I said, the most famous, perhaps classic rock album of the 1960s and one of the most famous hip-hop albums and mixed them together. And in a very crude metaphor, it's almost like drawing a moustache on the Mona Lisa, but he is creating something very new. I mean, this album, the Grey Album, got rave reviews. People absolutely love it. And as I've said earlier, the surviving Beatles loved it as well. Danger Mouse, aka Brian Burton, he sampled both these albums. And sampling is a collection of images, and remix is putting them into some form of composition. So in a way, he's not just copying when he's doing this, he's composing and creating something new. And there's lots of artistic precedents for this in music and in other fine art. For example, Marcel Duchamp, the Surrealist, and Picasso's collage art is an example of this. You put disparate objects together and you create something new with very different objects. Now, Mark Rodson has been quoted in a TEDx talk about Brian Burton, aka Danger Mouse's The Grey Album, and he has said this: you could say that all humans are sampling machines. We all learn by taking in what we hear and see and trying to imitate it and output it again. That's how we learn to speak. That's how we learn to paint and make music as well. So think of mashup culture as a hybrid, a mix, a collage, a coming together of disparate forms of art, and very iconic forms of art as well. Also, the mashup of Jay-Z and the Beatles, it is elliptical, it's jarring, it's repetitive, it's a sort of a short circuit, it's a fissure, it's a gap. Zizek has written that the short circuit is a faulty connection, and that itself is quite aesthetically transgressive, beautiful, enticing, enchanting, because we hear the loops. If one little piece of music is really aesthetically pleasing and beautiful and nice to listen to, why not just repeat it? Why not interrupt it with a classic song? Why not create new texts out of the old? And that's exactly what Danger Mouse has done. Also, it's fascinating as well that Danger Mouse's The Grey Album is absolutely predicated on new technology. You can sync sounds perfectly together from different albums. Now, you couldn't have made this album before the early noughties because we didn't have the technology. I'll give you a quick example of that. I mean, all those classic Beatles albums that you know in the 1960s, from their first album, Please Please Me, which was released on the 11th of February 1963, right up to the White Album, recorded on 4 tracks. Whereas someone like Danger Mouse, with computers, with technology, has an infinite number of tracks that he can use. So in a sense, the Grey Album stood perfectly balanced on the cusp of 2 tectonic plates as they shifted and crunched into new formations. Now, just to come to the conclusion of what I've been saying today, I'll put it into a few very salient points. First of all, let's just look very quickly at the biography of Danger Mouse, aka Brian Burton. This mashup of the White Album and the Black Album absolutely made his career. Burton has now worked with Beck, Gorillaz, the Black Keys, U2. He's been a Grammy winner. It has built his career. Second point, aesthetically, he has created something new in a sense. Danger Mouse managed to rework these familiar source texts, the Beatles' White Album and Jay-Z's The Black Album, in ways that brought out characteristics that none had noticed quite in this way before. He's gone far back to look far forward. He's transformed 2 familiar, iconic pieces of work into something absolutely brand spanking new. And a lovely piece of work it is. From a perspective as a Beatles scholar and fan, I absolutely love the Grey Album. Now, I know more conservative Beatles fans would have been outraged. How dare you mess with this classic piece of art? Don't touch it. It's deified, enshrined up there in the canon of Beatles works. You should not be touching this. But he did. Also, it shows actually that Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr are quite progressive guys. As I'm standing here speaking, Paul McCartney is 80 on the 18th of June in 16 days' time. And he still loves remix music. He loves mashing. He likes people changing his art into something new. So a lot of innate conservatism that criticized Danger Mouse's mashup absolutely has been rejected by this piece. Now, again, from a personal point of view, I absolutely love this mashup, this mix. I would say putting together the Beatles' White Album with Jay-Z's The Black Album, in a sense, the art of the Grey Album is like eating pineapple and cheese together on a cocktail stick. It shouldn't work, but it tastes delicious. Also, we don't have time to go into this too much in the talk, apart from to say many people could see this as quite a revolutionary act, taking 2 classic albums and mashing them and mixing them and creating a third album. But this idea of revolutionary subversion, I'm not so sure about that, because there's always been collage art, Picasso, Duchamp, all of those people. And I've been recently researching a book called The Beatles and Black Music, and this Jay-Z Beatles Danger Mouse mashup is chapter 6 of the book. And while I've been researching this book, I've been looking into all the Beatles music And it appropriates so many tunes, riffs, ideas from music that has gone before. So, in a sense, a lot of art isn't particularly original. It is collage. Um, Let me just say this. It is, maybe you could contend that the Grey Album is not revolutionary. It's not a radical break with the past. It is not revolutionary, subversive, or rebellious. Technologically, conceptually, compositionally, sonically, musically, politically, or even economically, it displays a tremendous amount of continuity with a broad range of aesthetic ancestors. As I said, Picasso's Cubism, Braque's Cubism, collage art, something which the Beatles were very aware of as well. I mean, the Beatles' most famous album is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and what that album was a mix of different types of music. It was a blurring of high art and low art, blurring the distinctions between high and low art. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was very appropriately released in June 1967, it blended classical orchestration with pop songs, with rhythm and blues, with rock music, with ballads, with vaudeville, with world music, with Indian music. So Sgt. Pepper was a collage itself, as was the White Album, as I said earlier, was a mix of experimental classical music, electronic music from Karl Stockhausen and Steve Reich. All of those people, Steve Reich, sorry. So music itself is a collage. Beatles covers were a collage as well, especially Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which put together musicians, writers, high art, Joyce, Shaw, Wilde, with singers such as Dion and Bob Dylan. So the Beatles were always into collage as status inversion, to break down the boundaries between high and low art. Now, I must just come to an end, and how I'll sum this up is that the Grey Album has proved to be very popular. If it came out in 2021, record companies would be all over it and would give it an official release, and it would be one of the best-selling albums of the year. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr love the album as well. That's the aesthetic worth of the album. And just to sum up, I'm going to subvert a familiar aphorism in the way that Brian Burton, aka Danger Mouse, subverted the Beatles' White Album and Jay-Z's The Black Album. In a manner similar to Danger Mouse's subversion of two classic canonical albums by mashing them together to make a third hybrid piece of art, I will end my talk by inverting and subverting a familiar aphorism in the spirit of Danger Mouse's Brian Burton's mashup. Two's a crowd and three's company.